we were somewhere on Elm Street near Frank Springer's old office. And we were under the plum trees and walked into the opening when suddenly it was very bright. A fluorescent light showed on the ground like a weird daylight. I looked up, and there in the sky, I saw a very big light. It was very large, silent, and round. The bottom had the fluorescent light, and around the edges was more of a yellow light. It looked just like a typical round saucer, like the ones in the photos, except around the outside edge it had what looked like headlights or round lights with different types of white lights, and the bottom was dome-shaped and had this fluorescent light that was showing on the ground. It was huge and just above the treetops, about the size of 2 houses. I was stunned looking at this object. I was thinking to myself, it's going to hit the trees, and I said to my friend, oh my, it's going to hit the treetops. But it didn't. It moved very slowly, smoothly, and silently over the houses and trees. It did not make a sound. It was very scary. And after just a few seconds, I said something else to my friend, and we hightailed it back to our campsite, which was close by. This is something I will never forget. Even today, I remember it as though it was yesterday. It's 1963. Another story, more recent. Sunday, November 4, 2016, 8 p.m., Marlon Cracker is on his way to pick up his son from his mother's house in Chippewa Falls, waiting at a stoplight outside Chippewa Falls. A saucer-shaped craft approaches from behind his truck, and he writes to me, he says, it was large, flying low, barely clearing the treetops. And it definitely wanted me to see it. It had one purplish light at the bottom center that turned on slowly and got brighter and then slowly dimmed out and then slowly brighter and then dimmed out in pattern. I said, holy smokes, that's a flying saucer. And it's right above the hood of my truck. It was 100% exactly what you would think a flying saucer would look like. I would guess it was 100, 150 feet wide, 30 feet to the bottom. I had to lean way forward up over the steering wheel of my truck, crank my head up to see it, and I could see about 2/3 of its round shape. The object moved slowly at maybe 5 miles an hour, I would guess. I heard no audible sound. Well, Craker then pursues the craft until the bridge in Chippewa, and he pulls into a gas station to find somebody else and point it out, but he says, very strange, nobody was at the gas station. The lights were on, but not a soul to be seen. Just really weird, usually a busy stretch of road, fairly busy gas station, but I felt oddly alone. It was almost like a ghost town, which was so odd, because County J in that gas station on a Sunday night usually has traffic everywhere. And so he watched it move off into the distance, and he phoned the police and filed a police report, gave them a sketch of the object, and so forth. Anyway, these are the kind of stories that get submitted to my website, ufodays.net, which is a blog dedicated to chronicling the Elmwood encounters and other UFO stories from western Wisconsin and Minnesota that I find interesting. Today, I'm going to tell you a few of those stories primarily from 1975. But before I do, I'll tell you a little bit about me. I'm not from Elmwood, and I have never seen a UFO, a flying saucer, or anything weird or strange in my life. I'm not a professional UFO researcher. I'm a Bible teacher. I'm a pastor. I'm a history writer, and I'm an amateur academic in the field of the Jewishness of early Christianity. That's what I do. That's my day job. 6 years ago, my daughter, Miriam, who was 18 at the time, asked me about the existence of UFOs. And I said, oh no, honey, no. The Air Force did this long investigation of this subject called Project Blue Book, and they determined conclusively that there's nothing to those reports Just misidentifications of balloons and meteors and a lot of hype and sensationalism. I don't think she believed me. Because a few months later, she lent me a Time Life book on the subject that she had picked up at a Goodwill for 10 cents. And the first time, this is like the first time I'd ever read anything about UFOs and UFO history in my entire life. And I read this book in just a day or two, and I was like, I no longer know what to believe. I mean, it rocked my world. But I figured, I'm a researcher. This is what I do. I can figure this out. So I dug into the sources, and I used the internet to pull up the original newspaper articles from the summer of 1947 when the first flying saucer wave hit the United States. And my daughter and I started meeting for weekly pie and coffee at a diner in Hudson, Wisconsin, reading and discussing newspaper articles and unclassified government documents from 1947. Hundreds of articles we were combing through. And it did not take long for the sheer volume of consistent reports to persuade us that there must be some genuine, unexplained phenomenon at work behind these numerous and consistent reports from 1947. So I don't know about today, but at least in 1947, there was something going on. And we came to the conclusion that the UFO phenomenon, whatever it might be, was real. Whatever it is, it's something real. It's not mass hysteria. It's not a hoax. It's not misidentification. It's not weather phenomenon. It's not weather balloons. And after a year of this kind of research, we still hadn't made it out of 1947. That same year, by coincidence, the New York Times published a breaking story exposing a secret Pentagon program investigating UFOs. Maybe you heard about this. And since then, the Defense Department has released gun camera footage of unidentified flying objects and admitted that unknown objects that defy scientific explanation routinely intrude on U.S. airspace. And there, in fact, just in May, we had the first round of congressional hearings on the subject, just a few weeks ago. And just last week, this is like current news, just last week, the government announced the formation of a new Pentagon office called the Anomaly Resolution Office for studying and cataloging the phenomenon within the DoD. So, summer of 2018, I heard a public radio story about Elmwood's 40th anniversary UFO Days festival. It's the 40th anniversary of the festival. And so a colleague of mine and I said, we should go out there. We should just go out there and see what's going on out there. So we drove out to the event, and that inspired me to research the Elmwood cases as I had done with the 1947 cases. I figured, I have these skills. I can do this now. So I started digging into the historical reports of the Elmwood story, and I actually started the blog just as a place to catalog the research and some place to stick it online. And it didn't take long before people started submitting their stories to me. So that's my story. That's how I got into this racket, which is in some ways is really different from my day job. Elmwood claims to be the UFO capital of the world. And the title seems audacious, but it's actually well earned. According to Donald Schmidt of the Center for UFO Studies in 1987, the only location in the world to rival Elmwood for the number of high-quality sightings and encounters is New Mexico. Schmidt said that we have between 30 and 50 UFO reports out of Elmwood between 1968 and 1988. And that's a lot. We've had a series of flaps in Pierce County, and occasional reports continue to filter through to this very day, like that 2016 one I told you. And UFOs made Elmwood famous. The publicity started after George Wheeler's initial encounter on April 7, 1975, which you should now be somewhat familiar with. His story got picked up by newspapers, then the tabloids. It got picked up by the National Enquirer, a lot of credibility there. He even recorded the story of the encounter on a 1976 vinyl LP put out by Columbia Records called UFOs, The Credibility Factor, which I would love to find a copy of. If anybody has this album, please talk to me about it. A month later, a month after George Wheeler's sighting in April 1975, it was Carol Forster. The case of the school teacher and her children. If you went on the bus tour, Tom was leading the bus tour. That's one of the children that were in the car, and they were pursued and harassed by what at first appeared to be a star, but turned out to be a flying saucer that attempted to land in front of her vehicle. And then Officer Wheeler had his second encounter, even more dramatic than the first one, a year later. And according to him, the UFO shot him with some sort of energy wave or beam or blue light or something that disabled his patrol car. And that story, of course, received national attention because it's a very credible witness, this police officer. And this is what inspired the local celebration. I believe it was Stars and Stripes Day or something like that here in Elmwood, to change the name to UFO Days, and ultimately inspired businessman Tom Weber to propose building a UFO landing site and welcoming center at Elmwood, which was just preposterous enough to tickle the fancy of the media and garner national and international attention, so that even Dan Rather flew here on a helicopter to Elmwood to record a feature for CBS News. And Elmwood witnesses ended up on Geraldo Rivera, and the Pentagon also started paying attention to Elmwood too. So according to New York Times investigative journalist and Pulitzer Prize winner Howard Bloom, in his book Out There, the Pentagon had an unofficial secret UFO program in the late 80s headed by super spook John Alexander. If you're into this kind of like crazy stuff, you should know that name, John Alexander, but you probably don't because it was a secret up until recently. Anyway, he was a military intelligence officer working with the government's secret remote viewing project. Have you seen Stranger Things? No? Okay. Same project that inspired the Netflix show Stranger Things. The secret UFO program, which might have been called the UFO Working Group, that's what Bloom says it was called. John Alexander gives it a different name. Anyway, they were meeting, I'm not sure, they were meeting somewhere in these secret meetings in the 80s, and they had a collection of scientists, researchers, intelligence officers hidden away maybe in the basement of the Pentagon or something like this. The UFO Working Group. They sent 2 agents from the CIA's domestic collection branch. Who knew that the CIA has a domestic collection branch? But anyway, they send 2 agents from the CIA's domestic collection branch to Elmwood's UFO Days festival in 1988. And these agents come here and they pretend to be NASA scientists. And they interview local witnesses, and they're taking soil samples and walking around with their Geiger counters and whatnot, and checking against military records and the timing of these sightings and so forth. This is all true stuff. It's documented. This is a New York Times investigative journalist is pulling this up. If you want a copy of this book, I have some extra copies that I brought along. Not too many, maybe 6 or 7 of them, or something like that. But you can talk to me about it. I can pull those out for you.
What year was the CIA here?
Yeah, in 1988. The CIA is here in 1988. It's crazy. You know, most people didn't even know, to this day, most people don't know that the Pentagon had a secret UFO program going back in the 1980s. But they were sending CIA agents here, and allegedly, the agents returned to the Pentagon with nothing but a t-shirt. Anyway, those are the big, famous Elmwood stories. But there's a lot more to the story. Back in 1975, 1976, when George Wheeler and Carol Forster and these cases were happening, there were a lot of local UFO stories in western Wisconsin and the vicinity, and I've been digging them up. So that's what I want to tell you. I'm just going to crash through this material and just talk really fast. I'm going to start with a foggy night in December 2, 1974. A guy named William Bosack, a 68-year-old farmer from Frederick, Wisconsin, spots an object on the side of the road. It kind of resolves out of the fog into his headlights, so he slows to a stop, and his headlights are reflecting off a saucer-shaped object beside the road, which appears to be 8 to 10 feet in height, has a transparent bullet-shaped dome on the top, and Bosack says he could see a figure seated inside, and this is terrifying to him, a strange-looking creature with hair on the sides of its head and ears protruding, he said, like a calf's ears. And so he said, oh, that's enough of that, and he sped away. But he reported this to the police, and then this ended up in the newspapers. A month later, on January 21st of 1975, Mitch Doverspike and Scott Fetty, two 16-year-old boys of rural Durand. How do you say that? Durand, okay. Of rural Durand. They see something in the sky about 5 miles south of town. This case was investigated by J. Allen Hynek's Center for UFO Studies. I did a write-up about this sighting on the blog, and Mitch Doverspike saw the write-up, and he contacted me to set the record straight. Here's how he remembers the night, 45 years later. He says, I witnessed this. At first, it was standing completely still, 200 feet or less in the air, completely silent. We shut the car off, and we got out. The lights were extremely bright and no noise at all. When it took off, it sounded like a jet airplane, shoo, and was gone in a split second. It went from just above our heads to beyond the horizon. Nothing, but nothing of this earth could move that fast, from a silent dead stop to gone in a split second, he said. So Doverspike and Fetty weren't the only ones who were seeing lights that night in the skies over Durand. Meanwhile, that same month, January 1975, a Plymouth woman named Sheila sees a strange blue light outside her home. It's a snowy night, there's been snow, the plows are out. A few hours later, her 2-year-old wakes her up crying, blue light, which is kind of freaky to a mom. She's home alone with her child. But what she finds out later is that at that same time, her brother-in-law, Jeff, was returning from snow plowing. He's driving the plow when he saw this blue light hovering over his sister-in-law's house, and the electrical systems on the plow failed. The lights went out, the vehicle stalled, and a circular object, which turned out to be the source of this blue light, dives out of the sky towards the plow. So Jeff thinks it's going to hit the plow. He jumps out of the plow into the ditch, and as the blue circle soars past him into the sky, he looks up, and this is actually physically and electrically impossible, but this is what he says happened. The engine of the plow started up again, and its lights came on, and it lurched forward. All right, I don't know. That same month, 20 miles away, a woman named Kay is driving home at night when she's pursued by 3 white lights. The lights finally spin off and disappear. She arrives home, find out she's missing an hour of time and suffering physical and psychological issues. That's all I'll say about that. That's all I really know about that. These cases were in the Minneapolis Star Trib, and they were investigated by former CIA operative Bradley Ayers, who at that time was working for Hynek's Center for UFO Studies. So this was the Minneapolis Star Tribune. Then, that's January. Then comes Carol Forster's incident, March 2, 1975. Her story's been told enough times And you've heard it now on the bus tour, I hope. Just to summarize, Elmwood school teacher Carol Forster is driving home at night with her children in the car after a visit to Arkansas, Wisconsin, and they see this bright star, and so they start talking about the Star of Bethlehem, and they start to sing "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star," right? But it isn't a star. It's following them. It follows them for miles. It draws closer. They start to get a little panicked. And then she stops at a farm, points it out to the farmer, and then she's like, okay, she continues on her way. She tries to continue on her way. The star comes down, intercepts her car, almost landing in the road in front of her. Turns out to be a classic flying saucer. Her children are terrified. Mrs. Forster drives backwards to the neighbor's farm. The craft removes itself to hover, she says, at treetop level. But even then follows the family home. When her husband arrives home later that night, it's still visible as an orange light hovering over a nearby field. 2 weeks after Forster's sighting, on March 13, 1975, a saucer-shaped object lands in the road just outside Philip Baker's farmhouse near Mellon, Wisconsin. This is a famous case. Baker's daughter, Jane, discovers it while she's putting the cats out. And there's this thing out in the road, and it has these bluish-green lights circling the circumference, and from the center is coming this bright yellow light, and it's emitting a high-pitched whining noise, and so she's terrified, and she runs back inside and gets the family. So the whole family comes piling out. Mr. Baker is being the man of the house. He's going to go walk up to it, and his wife's shouting, "Don't go near that thing!" And they can hear something banging inside, clang, 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 like metal on metal inside the saucer. And so he thinks maybe my wife's right. He goes back inside the house. They call the police. And as they call the police, there's this percussive sound outside, and the saucer disappears. So this family was later interviewed on Leonard Nimoy's In Search Of, and you can see my edit of that interview at ufodays.net. That's Mellon, Wisconsin, March 13, 1975, just 11 days after Carol Forster's story. But that same night then, deputies and police in Ashland, Wisconsin, and Iron County received multiple reports of lighted craft moving through the area. The deputies take to the road to see if they can spot these objects, and they did. They saw a total of 4 during the next few hours, the brightest of them changing colors as it moved through the sky. A total of 9 deputies in Ashland and Iron County saw these lighted objects cavorting through the sky. Ashland County Sheriff Joe Croteau said, "Telephones were ringing off the hook from citizens who also saw this." Peter Drolson, a 24-year-old Ashland County deputy, he's listening to this on the radio, and he's thinking, I never get to see anything, right? She's like, everybody was seeing UFOs that night except for me. So he parks his patrol car at the end of a road overlooking Lake Superior. When he receives a radio message, they're saying, "It's going your way." So he gets out of his car. He's got the radio in his hand, the transmitter is still in his hand. And he's talking to them as it's coming over the treetops. He says, "Everything got so bright I could have read a newspaper. I could see my shadow on the ground. I was leaning against the car with the microphone in my hand. And whatever it was came from the west behind me going east across the road. All I could see was this bright glow, maybe a couple blocks behind me at treetop level. In a brief few seconds, it passed over the trees on the other side of the road and was gone." Meanwhile, the guys on the other end of the transmission, as he was talking to them, they lost his transmission as it passed over. It just went to static while the craft was passing over. That same night, only 24 hours after the Baker family's encounter, only 12 days after Forster's frightening encounter, there was an incident at Plum City. 2 young couples are snowmobiling in the woods near Plum City. It's dark. It's about 10:30 p.m. It's Mr. and Mrs. William Gibson of Plum City and Mr. and Mrs. Michael Kitchener of Maiden Rock. And they see two lights with a big red light associated with it approaching over the trees. And so they assume that, it must be a road. And they assume it's a car on a road. And then they realize there is no road over there. And meantime, these lights keep drawing closer, and then the object comes into view. And it comes down, and Gibson says, almost to treetop level. And it just hovers there. And Mrs. Gibson said she observed four legs like landing gear extending from the underside. And she said the object appeared to be metallic with a surface that reminded her of crinkled up aluminum foil stretched out again. So they get back on their snowmobiles and they head in the opposite direction as fast as they can. They stop at the first farmhouse they come to. Mrs. Gibson, she didn't know who it belonged to. She just runs in the front door of this stranger's house, hysterical with terror. She told all this to Jack Brostock, professor of biology at the University of Wisconsin River Falls, and MUFON UFO investigator. And she told this story. She felt scared to death. He verified it with the other three witnesses. Okay, so all of that is just, that's, where are we? We're still in March of 1975, right? And this is all going down around here. Then, of course, we come to April, and that's George Wheeler's story, which you've heard about his encounter as he's finishing up his rounds on Tuttle Hill. Joe Souchere, I don't know who remembers Joe Souchere. All right, Joe Souchere knew this guy, and he interviewed him for the Minneapolis Tribune. So I pulled that story up. Wheeler said, I thought for sure a plane was crashing. I thought a plane was going to wipe out the town. It was like the size of a football field. I hit the ditch and the thing passed over me. I saw a blue flame shoot out of it. It cut at a right angle, moved at fantastic speed. I'd say 1,500 to 1,800 miles per hour if I had to guess. So he gets back in his car and he goes up to the top of Tuttle Hill where he can study the object, and he gets a better view of it. He says it was cigar-shaped, and it sped off towards Ellsworth and Wheeler, he says. So then he's like, what do I do? And he hesitantly put in a call to Ellsworth Village Hall. They told him, George, you're not crazy. People have been making similar reports for about 2 hours. Been getting these calls for 2 hours. One of those similar reports was a call that came in at 11:25 p.m. that night from Donna Kohler, now Hoyt, Donna Hoyt of Maiden Rock, who saw bright lights in and around her neighbor's empty and otherwise unlit trailer home. And she and her husband were looking through the window of their trailer home, and they're looking through the window and they see what's going on over there. The light showed orange, she said, and sometimes it switched colors and twinkled green and blue and red and white. And every time I'd turn off the lights in her house, it would move closer to us. Then when we turned them back on, it would back off. I was kind of scared, I'll tell you. She called the police. She called her brother. Then the Kohlers loaded their 3-month-old daughter into the car and took off. Donna said the minute we got in the car, we took off, and it was like the light just bounced almost over the top of us and down these little gullies that we live in. And I hollered at my husband, and he kept going, and it come up again, and I hollered, and it landed out in the field. And I looked out there, and there's this great big glow of orange. Now, you got to remember, all this is happening just hours before Officer Wheeler's sighting. The United Press picked up the story and added, other UFOs have been sighted in the western portion of Wisconsin and the Fox River Valley, and there have been no official explanations. Another call to the police that same night came from Nancy Thies. She saw a UFO with lights flashing from orange to blue and called the police. So Police Deputy Carl Ryden, who took the call, he says, I'm going to go out and see what's going on. He goes out, sees this thing. He says, I saw that thing hanging up above the trees. It started coming for me like a big blue and yellow train light. It veered away to the north. I couldn't say what it was. It's hard to explain it, even if you see it. And at some point that same night, Ellsworth farmer by the name of Howard Young watched something the shape of a silo top hover over his field for an hour. Joe Souchere asked him, "Weren't you scared?" Young says, "Nah, nothing to be scared about. Can't hurt you." So these sightings, you can imagine, garnered a lot of attention. So on April 9, the newspapers were saying UFO watches are being held nightly in the triangular area in Pierce County encompassing Elmwood, Plum City, and Ellsworth because UFOs have reportedly been spotted regularly for the past 3 weeks. People were going out in carloads to watch the skies and look for more. And over the summer of '75, we had reports from Washburn, New Berlin, Hayward, and as far across the state as Sturgeon Bay and Greenfield and Twin Lakes, while the air base up in Duluth was tracking objects over Lake Superior. On the evening of September 15th, Garner Hadland of Bayfield, who owned the local cable TV station, reported a circular UFO hovering over the hills of Bayfield in daylight. He said it had no windows, looked like it was made of cast aluminum, had a dome on the top and a hump on the bottom, 100 feet in diameter disc, hovering over the trees. And on one side of it, the side away from the sun, it was bright orange. All right, that's all. Now here's the interesting part. You know, when you're searching, your searches lead, one search leads to another. I kind of widened the search parameters into Iowa, and pulled up this really interesting parallel case to the Carol Forster case from Laverne, Iowa. And the parallels are so close. I'm going to read the whole story as it appeared in the Algona Upper Des Moines Press of November 27, 1975. It's very short. I'm just going to read this story to you. 6 children, ages 13 to 19, were on their way home at 11:50 p.m. one Friday night when a brilliant light appeared to be falling out of the sky. Noticing it, they even said something about wishing on a falling star. Then the falling star came right at their car, and they feared they were going to crash into whatever it was. The driver stepped on it, up to 90 miles per hour, but the very brilliant lights accompanied them off to the side of the car. The kids were terrified, afraid to even look at it. They drove to the home of 4 of the children, with the UFO accompanying them all the way. In the frenzy of it all, their car ran into another which was parked on the property. The children left it, running, and fled to the house with the cries of "Something is after us." Not only were the parents in time to see the UFO hovering above the barn, but they stayed up all night keeping track of it as it stayed far above their farm until 6:15 a.m. It was shaped like a bun, the woman said. It had real bright glowing lights, green at one end, red at the other, and yellowish white in the middle, and it moved in jerks as it hovered, like 1 step back, 2 steps forward. One of the boys grabbed a shotgun, but we said, "Don't shoot it, for God's sakes." Telephone calls were made, first to the Mason City Airport, where there was no answer, then to the Des Moines Airport, where they received advice from a military source to keep watching it and report back only if it comes down and lands. And the third call to Laverne Town Marshal Bob Bloomer, who came to the farm and saw what appeared to be a bright, moving light very far above. Bloomer said men from Corwith and Kanawha areas, some with CB radios, patrolled the entire area. The woman said the all-night vigil produced one surprise. At a certain point, for a period of about 30 to 45 minutes, the craft's lights began blinking real slow, and it appeared to be turning over. And when day came, they couldn't see it anymore, nor have they seen anything else since. I just wanted to read that whole story because there's just such an amazing parallel to what had happened right here in April to that school teacher and her children. But meanwhile, back in Elmwood, Paul Fredrickson had his sighting October 20, 1975 on Tuttle Hill. And his son was in the car and said, "Is that the moon?" He said, "That's not the moon." And they pulled off and jumped out and watched a huge gray metallic object pass about 800 feet overhead. He said, "It made no sound except when it got right above us. Then there was a soft whir, and it went like this, whew, and it was gone." On another occasion, while driving home from a class in another town, Frederickson and two others watched a bright light bobbing in front of the car that was in front of them on the highway. And then, so both cars pulled over, and there were two women in the first car who were terrified. And so Frederickson accompanied them home, and a short time later, the lights disappeared. So this stuff is going on. And he said after Wheeler's experience, a lot of other people came forward and said, "Yeah, I saw something too." On November 2nd, across the border in Medford, there was a major incident. Multiple witnesses saw a lighted craft descend over town and land in the football field. And it left a withered patch of grass in the football field, which seemed to indicate the landing spot. And this was investigated again by J. Allen Hynek of the Center for UFO Studies. It was featured on Leonard Nimoy's In Search Of, and you can watch my edit of that story as well. There was there was a lot more. You know, I'm just at a certain point it just becomes redundant to just keep reading these. It may be just coincidence, and it's not a local UFO story at all. But in October 1975 into November 1975, the Pentagon was dealing with a major UFO problem. This came up from the Washington Post. Air Force and NORAD documents obtained by the Washington Post provided detailed accounts of sightings of unexplained objects from Loring Air Force Base in Maine, Wurtsmith Air Force Base in Michigan, Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana, all within that 2-week period of time. As those and other missile launching sites in the northern tier states, military personnel were reporting that the objects they'd seen objects hovering over nuclear weapons storage areas, and in some cases as low as 10 feet off the ground over missile silos before they departed. That was the same time. That was going on at the same time, 1975, quite a year. And then the following April is 1976, April 1976. Officer George Wheeler had his second encounter up by the quarry, the one that disabled both him and his car, and so forth. So that's 1975. That's the story of 1975. These sort of things continued on. It really picked up again in 1979. You can read about the Val Johnson case in Minnesota. It's another famous police officer case. That's the one where the craft, or whatever it was, the orb of light or whatever it was, struck his car. And they still have, if you go up there, you can actually see the patrol car. They keep it in a museum. And so you can see the damage that was done to the vehicle. It's a very famous story, the Val Johnson of Warren, Minnesota. Meanwhile, that case actually is the first in a string of them. We have compelling UFO stories in 1979 at Balsam Lake, New Richmond, Dresser, Baldwin, Half Moon Lake, all investigated by this character, Bradley Ayers, of J. Allen Hynek's Center for UFO Studies. And he said to the Hudson Observer, he made these comments. He said, "People in this part of the country tend to be more conservative and skeptical. They simply aren't the type to conjure up this kind of fantasy. If anything, they'd be the kind who would have scoffed at UFOs, before their sightings, of course." So when asked what people are seeing, Ayers replied, "I don't buy any one theory more than any other. All I know is it's exciting and scary as hell." He said, the appearance of a UFO cannot be predicted. If one is seen at a given location and moving in a certain direction, its next appearance cannot be calculated like a plane's course could be. Persons cannot go UFO hunting. The objects move at unrealistic speeds, seem to materialize and dematerialize at will, change direction instantaneously and at 90-degree angles, not banking as airplanes do. There is no evidence yet that UFOs are nuts and bolts or physical things, Ayers said. He observed that if the phenomenon is the result of mechanical processes, it represents a technology that boggles the mind. And he concludes, it may well be a religious problem. I tend to think he's right. I think this may well be a religious problem, that this is a spiritual phenomenon. And that's my department. That's what I do for a living. But I don't know. I don't know. For now, I'm just collecting Elmwood area UFO stories, putting them online at ufodays.net. So if you've got a story to tell, I would love to hear it and add it to the collection. Thank you. What do I mean by a religious problem is the question, or what did Bradley Ayers mean by a religious problem? Let me tell you something about a religious approach to the UFO question. On the one hand, UFOs seem to have a lot in common with demonology. Especially when you get into the abduction type of encounters. On the other hand, Billy Graham wrote a book where he compared it to angelology, and he suggested that there's perhaps a crossover with the Ezekiel's vision in Ezekiel chapter 1. In Judaism, there are three main types of angels that are often spoken of. You see them in your Bible as cherubs, seraphs, and wheels. So it's cherubim, those are the cherubs. Nobody knows what the Hebrew means, cherubim. Nobody knows what that is. Seraphim, that means burning ones. Ophanim, that means wheels. What are wheels? And then there's the fourth one, another name for cherubs, is chayot. Chayot means living creatures or beings. So that's what I mean by it may be a religious problem. I don't know. Nobody knows what we're dealing with. And that's what makes it so interesting, and why you have a town festival about it.
Do you have any theories that you believe more than others?
Do I have my personal theories, my personal pet theories? I think I'm fascinated by the fact that this all really started in 1947. I find that to be really compelling. 1947 comes shortly after we started popping off atom bombs. And something changed. There's something changed in the fabric of reality, I think, when we started busting atoms up. And who knows? I don't know. I mean, it could have been, if we're dealing with extraterrestrials, which is the predominant theory, the favored theory, if you're dealing with extraterrestrials, perhaps popping off atom bombs is like sends a signal and says, hey, we're here. I don't know. Yes?
Just curious if you've heard of the I think it's called the attack on San Francisco, where the
Battle of Los Angeles.
Battle of Los Angeles, that's the one.
Yeah.
Yeah, all right.
Yeah. It's 1942.
Yeah.
The Battle of Los Angeles was an air raid, or so it was thought, Japanese air raid over Los Angeles, a huge amount of ordnance was fired at an object that slowly moved in over Los Angeles, and it's it was in spotlights, and all these spotlights were on this thing as it came in over the city, and it moved very slowly over the city. And either, it's like they were shooting at this thing for like an hour and didn't take it down. So after this happened, nobody was certain was there really something there or not, or were we just shooting at the sky? That's the story. But yeah, that really happened. Yep. Yes.
Do you think, like, if there have been crashes with UFOs, has there been like a lot of reverse engineering that like government and private contractors that kind of wanted that? So
Yeah, that's the Bob Lazar kind of, I don't know who else advocates that idea that there's a lot of technology that's been gleaned from crash retrievals. I'm not persuaded there are crash retrievals. I have yet to see any real evidence of that. If there is, the government has done an amazing job at concealing that, so much so that it's concealed it from itself. And it's just not there in the records whatsoever. I'm not saying that's not, maybe. I just haven't seen any real evidence of that. So I can't, I don't know. We do have stuff that has fallen from these objects. And they have studied that, and we have reports on that. There's a scientist from Stanford named Gary Nolan who has done a lot of analysis on those types of things. And the strange and darndest thing about it is it turns out that everything that seems to fall out of a UFO is terrestrial. It's like stuff from Earth. So Jacques Vallée, the French researcher, called them the tricksters. All right. Okay, everybody, thank you for coming to my 5 o'clock lecture.
Have you seen note?
Yeah, I did. If you have, if you want to find me or reach me, it's ufodays.net.